Welcome to Nasdaq Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, global markets reporter at Nasdaq. Former undocumented immigrant Laz Ayala agrees with President Trump. There's a national emergency at the border, but instead of blaming immigrants, let's get to the roots of the problem. Undocumented workers have become essential in certain industries. Author and producer of Illegal Laz Ayala joins me to discuss. Laz, it's great to have you with us on Trade Talks. Thank you for sharing your story and tell us a bit more about coming to America.
Thank you for having me with you. Yes, my story, how I came to the USA. I came here in 1981 with my father and older brother. We were fleeing from the Civil War of the 80s that destroyed, devastated the country of El Salvador. And we basically had to just, on a whim, pick up and leave for safety, flee for safety. And we ended up crossing Guatemala, Mexico, all the way up to the US-Mexican border in Tijuana, where the three of us crossed the US border in the trunk of a car, all arranged by smugglers.
Mhm. So
I settled in Southern California, lived there for the first 7 years, learned English with the support of my oldest sister who had been living here in the US at the time. She helped me get enrolled in school. I was able to, go to high school, get a high school diploma, got enrolled at a community college where I was paying for my own books and tuition. But on the second term of college, I was told that I couldn't continue because I was here living undocumented. So I had to drop out of college. I tell people when I share my story that I was a dreamer 30 something years ago before the term dreamer was even used.
yeah, when you were telling me your story, that was the first thing that I thought about as well. So let's get to the heart of Illegal. Tell us what it's about and what was the genesis behind the project?
So Illegal started about 4 years ago. I've been living here in the US for nearly 40 years now. And I have to say that I have never felt the level of criminalization and dehumanization towards immigrants that we feel today. And so 4 years ago, when that rhetoric of dehumanizing and criminalizing immigrants reached new peaks, I felt like my own dignity, my own humanity was under attack because the suggestion that undocumented immigrants are murderers and tax cheats and drug dealers and gangsters and rapists is not a description that fits my story, that describes my story, nor is it a description that describes the story of many undocumented immigrants that I know personally. Many of them are relatives of mine. So I felt like there was a need for someone like myself with my story, someone who has experienced what it is like to live in this country undocumented, to share that story. And after waiting for years for someone to step up, someone from these organizations that are out there advocating supposedly for undocumented immigrants to tell the story, or for perhaps someone else to tell the story, because I didn't think that that I was really, you know, qualified or enough. There were perhaps others who were already engaged in these conversations that could do a better job. But after waiting for years, I realized that, well, no one is stepping up, and I felt very compelled to share my story. And I started doing that simply by sharing my story the very first time with my Rotary Club here in Southern Oregon. And then that started the conversation with other clubs. And that got things going where I was writing op-eds for the local newspaper. And then I was asked to speak at different venues, colleges, universities, high schools. And then I felt empowered, and of course I was getting support everywhere I went. It was a lot of just heads nodding, saying, "Yes, keep going, we're behind you." And about a year later, I decided to write a book and use that book perhaps as a trampoline to engage in the national conversation. And when I was in the middle of finishing that book, the gentleman that I hired to recorded one of my presentations asked me if I had ever considered doing a documentary. And I said, well, I like the idea, but no, I'm in the middle of writing this book. And so, but within a couple of months, I reached out to him again. I said, let's talk about this documentary. And so 2 months later, we were on the road producing a 78-minute feature film, which is now being screened at different film festivals all over the country, has won already a couple of awards, and it's has really generated a lot of interest and has me now sharing with you about our efforts. And the effort is to humanize the conversation. I'm doing this, primarily with the goal of humanizing the conversation, telling the story of the immigrant, the undocumented immigrant, educating the public, hoping to create public engagement so that we can, behind our legislative goals, so that we can get that support from the public, believing that policies don't come from the top down, they come from the bottom up, and nothing changes until until the voters demand change. And so that's my hope, is to get that engagement and take this message to Washington so we can have this conversation with our legislators about reforming the current broken system.
Laz, which industries depend on undocumented immigrants the most, and what's their impact on the U.S. economy?
So the industries that depend the most on undocumented immigrants, as you probably know, is at the very top is our agriculture industry. The backbone for the agriculture industry is undocumented labor. And, following that is construction, hospitality, the people that clean the rooms in hotels, that work in the kitchens. Undocumented immigrants are the backbone of these industries. And now, of course, there are other service jobs and low-paying manufacturing jobs that are also filled by undocumented immigrants. I mean, the economic benefit contribution to our GDP in this country by undocumented immigrants is estimated to be somewhere between 150 and $200 billion a year. The taxes that they pay alone, on average, is around $12 billion a year. Some argue that undocumented immigrants are actually carrying the Social Security benefits today because they're paying into these programs, Social Security, unemployment, Medicare, but they don't get to receive the taxes because they're here undocumented. So the economic contribution is huge.
Yeah, it certainly is. So Laz, a couple of questions here. Why are they not becoming documented? And the flip side of that is, why aren't the companies employing undocumented workers being penalized?
That's a great question. So why do we have this system? Well, I mean, I can talk about this all day long, but I know we have a very short time. I believe that the system that we have today is a system that exists by design. This is a systemic issue that started in the 60s after the government got rid of the Bracero program of the 50s, which allowed for guest workers, primarily at that time from Mexico, to come into the country to work season, and they would return to Mexico. The Bracero program ended towards the end of the 50s, and at that time is when we opened the doors to undocumented immigration. The Bracero program gave those workers basic protections and basic rights. They came here legally, they were vetted, and that ended because, I believe, because the system wanted to exploit these workers even more. And that resulted again in the abuses that occurred in the 60s and the early 70s, which pushed the Cesar Chavez movement. That was about reforming the system to give people certain basic rights. Well, that was accomplished, but the systemic issue continued of undocumented immigrants. And so it is there by design. I believe it's not there because undocumented immigrants choose to come here. It's there by design. It is there by design to lure undocumented workers to this country who are literally exploited, who are marginalized, who are criminalized, who are taxed, who have no votes, who have no representation. And then they are, of course, also used for political gain by politicians. What can we do? That is a question too, and I have an answer for that. the solution is, and by the way, we find ourselves in this situation not for a lack of solutions. The solutions are very clear and very simple, and it does not involve walls, and it does not involve spending $8 billion a year in border security or immigration security. Most of that money, by the way, goes into private detention facilities, about 60% of it, where detainees are treated as a commodity at the cost of $120 per day, and or building a wall at the border that's going to cost $20 billion. As long as there's demand on this side of the border for illegal employment, people will come. So we need to stop the demand, and we need to provide a legal supply of workers. How can we do that? We need to, one, reform our guest worker programs so that they provide an adequate supply of foreign labor that is needed to run these industries. We need to do a periodic assessment of that need, whether it's quarterly or biannually or annually, and through the Department of Labor, and say, okay, we need X number of visas for X industry, and open up the process for those visas to be issued, vet the workers. These would be vetted workers who would then come here in a humane way, legal way. They work their season. And by the way, this is what most developed countries do, if not all. People come in, they work their season, they return, they take their earnings back to their native countries, they invest those monies in their communities where they promote economic sustainability there. They are reunited with their families as opposed to being separated under the current system. They're separated not only there, but also here when they settle. And ultimately, workers, a great majority, don't want to live here. They don't want to settle here. They want to come here to work. They come here for economic reasons, a great majority. And so under the current system, we have a system that basically allows them to come in, a system that lures people in. And when they are here, they're trapped because they can't just easily go back. It costs $8,000 to $10,000 to get a smuggler to bring someone over across the border. Once you're here, you can't easily go back. Plus the other risks involved of making that journey. So we need to revamp our guest worker programs so that it provides an adequate supply of labor, legal labor, vetted labor. And secondly, we need to also make E-Verify mandatory, and we also need to enforce the law with the employers that attempt to circumvent the process. We need to have tough enforcement of the law with the employers. Ask yourself, why is it that only the worker is criminalized and the employers are not held accountable? And that is the system that we have. That's the system that we have. And that system, I believe, is there by design. It has been there for decades. Now, one could argue that there is an economic benefit to the country by exploiting people, put aside the moral or the humane aspects of this. But historically, there may have been an economic benefit. But I believe today, the negative impacts of this system is outweighing the benefits in terms of
I would
cost
agree with
of enforcement and the loss of production, the businesses, the farmers, the ranchers, the dairy farms that depend on this labor, the meat packing places that are subject to these raids where they disrupt their operations. You lose your workforce of 500 or 600 people. It's not easy to get back on production. So these disruptions have a huge impact on these businesses, not to mention the fact that you can't even find the workers. And so it is affecting industries. Our dairy farmers are going out of business, ranchers, you name it. These people are feeling this pain as much as the workers are feeling it also. And it's threatening our food supply. We're depending more and more today on imports for our food, which, by the way, it reminds me of the crisis that we are facing right now as a result of outsourcing medical supplies. We are outsourcing our food today to the degree that it is creating, I believe, a national threat to this country. Something to think about.
Yeah, it certainly is something to think about, Laz. Thanks so much. I mean, this is really going to take coordinated, humane, of course, legislation. Thanks so much for joining us on Trade Talks.
Thank you.
And thanks for joining me. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.